a royal protocol shattered, a family line bruised. Just 4 minutes ago, Buckingham Palace's secure chamber doors slammed shut, and Beatrice's husband was left on the outside. While royal insiders reeled in shock, Prince Edward made a move that's sending shockwaves through every tier of the monarchy. But what triggered this icy shutout? Was this a protective measure or a declaration of internal war? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began without warning. The palace corridors, typically quiet and restrained during security meetings, buzzed with confusion. A high-level private briefing had been scheduled, one known only to a select few. Just as the final doors were sealing, Beatrice's husband arrived confident, well-informed, and certain he had a place at the table. But what happened next defied every unspoken rule of royal discretion. A guard stepped forward, checked his clearance, then on direct command from Prince Edward denied him entry. No explanations, no appeals. The door shut with a finality that echoed louder than any outburst ever could. Inside the chamber, tension rippled. Palace aides, caught off guard, exchanged glances. Prince Edward remained composed, but those who know him well claimed his calm masked a storm of conflict. Beatrice's husband, humiliated in the hallway, was escorted away without resistance, his face a mask of quiet disbelief. But for those present, this wasn't just an exclusion, it was a message, and one sent with surgical precision. There was no confusion, no clerical error. This was a line drawn in stone. The order had come swiftly and unmistakably from Edward himself. In fact, 2 aides confirmed it was issued less than 10 minutes before the meeting began, meaning Edward had known of Beatrice's husband's intentions and preemptively acted. It wasn't just about secrecy, it was about control. A move to reinforce who was truly trusted within the inner sanctum of royal defense. But that raised the most haunting question of all. What exactly was about to be discussed behind those sealed doors that someone as close to the family as Beatrice's husband couldn't be allowed to hear? The York and Wessex families have long maintained an uneasy peace, but this act sent the balance into freefall. The quiet resentments that simmered beneath surface smiles suddenly burned into open hostility. Aides loyal to Beatrice were stunned. Sources close to Prince Andrew reportedly began calling in favours, questioning why Edward was permitted such unchecked authority. And at the centre of it all stood Beatrice's husband, once embraced, now stonewalled. In hushed tones, the speculation began. Some whispered of threats to national security. Others suggested Edward had received intelligence from confidential sources just hours earlier. A few even hinted at darker forces, internal betrayal, hidden alliances, and the possibility that someone close had been compromised. But whatever the truth, one fact remained unshakable. Prince Edward had just made a move that no one saw coming. And in doing so, he may have exposed wounds the royal family had desperately tried to keep hidden. But to understand why Prince Edward would risk open conflict within the firm, we must uncover the long-simmering tensions that have been kept tightly under wraps until now. Behind palace gates, not all family ties are equal. Those born royal are often cloaked in protection, while those who marry in are eyed with caution. And for Beatrice's husband, this invisible hierarchy may have just turned brutally real. But was this snub a personal vendetta, or part of a larger power play to protect what the monarchy holds most sacred? For decades, those who enter the royal family through marriage have walked a tightrope of inclusion and exclusion. The gilded invitation into the world of crowns and titles never comes without hidden costs, and often, the true price is access. Time and again, history has shown us how the spouses of royals are brought just close enough to taste the power, but never close enough to hold it. Princess Diana, Sarah Ferguson, even Meghan Markle, all were celebrated in public but restricted behind closed doors. And now, that same pattern seems to have found its latest victim in Beatrice's husband. Though he carries the grace of diplomacy and the charm of modern aristocracy, his bloodline lacks the one thing the monarchy has always prioritized above all else: royal birthright. Within the inner circles of the firm, Prince Edward is seen as a guardian of that code. He doesn't entertain sentiment when the stability of the institution is at stake. He has, by all accounts, taken it upon himself to preserve the hard walls of royal secrecy, even if it means bruising familial bonds in the process. And in his eyes, the briefing in question was never about courtesy, it was about containment. Edward's philosophy, whispered often among his allies, is built on one unforgiving truth: outsiders, no matter how well-meaning, pose risk. It was this belief that likely drove him to act with such precision and without apology. Beatrice's husband, however, has never been content to play a passive role. As her presence within the royal family grew, so did his interest in understanding the machine behind the crown. Sources claim he began asking pointed questions about palace routines, about the nature of security meetings, about who exactly got access to sensitive briefings. His curiosity, though subtle, didn't go unnoticed. At least 3 aides flagged his inquiries as unusual, and quiet warnings were reportedly passed down the line. Warnings, it seems, that went ignored, or perhaps warnings that were taken as a challenge. And then there's the shadow of Camilla, the ultimate outsider turned insider. Her controversial rise to Queen Consort set a dangerous precedent in the eyes of many senior royals. Some believed it opened the floodgates to unchecked integration. Others, like Edward, saw it as a cautionary tale. The internal fractures created by her ascent, splits in loyalty, questions of protocol, and shifting power dynamics left scars still visible beneath the palace's polished exterior. To Edward, allowing another outsider too close to the centre may have felt like repeating history's most destabilizing gamble. But if Prince Edward thought he could keep the fallout contained to a closed door and a denied entry, he miscalculated. Because what came next was not silence but fury. And while the lines between trust and exclusion blurred in that moment, another layer of drama was quietly building, this time involving Beatrice herself. Inside the palace's rarely used Crimson Gallery, a storm broke loose. Beatrice, normally composed, demanded answers from her uncle with a fury that stunned royal staff. Words were exchanged that shook the very foundations of family loyalty and may have set off a new chain reaction within the monarchy's inner circles. The confrontation was never meant to be seen. It was supposed to be a private discussion, a measured exchange between niece and uncle. But what unfolded behind those crimson walls was nothing short of seismic. Beatrice, fueled by a mix of betrayal, humiliation, and disbelief, tore into Prince Edward with a force that shattered the expected decorum of royal dialogue. Sources close to the staff said her voice cracked, not from rage alone, but from heartbreak. She demanded to know how her husband, a man who had stood beside her through the monarchy's most trying transitions, could be denied like a stranger. Her words were sharp, but the wound behind them was unmistakable. Edward didn't flinch. His reply came cold and clipped. Security comes before sentiment. That line, according to multiple leaked accounts, left a chill in the room that not even time could thaw. To him, the decision wasn't personal, it was protocol. But to Beatrice, it was personal in every possible way. She accused him of orchestrating a public humiliation, of using his rank to sabotage her marriage's place within the royal framework. She said it wasn't just about her husband, it was about her status, her relevance, and whether the family she had defended with loyalty was now turning against her. The emotional toll was immediate and visible. Beatrice broke down in front of the very staff trained to never show emotion. She reportedly said she was finished with this circus and hinted at walking away from royal responsibilities altogether. Not in anger, but in grief. In that moment, her crown felt heavier than ever before, an inheritance now tainted with betrayal. And while Edward remained stone-faced, others in the room were shaken, none more than Princess Eugenie, who watched silently from the edge of the gallery. She didn't speak, but her presence was powerful. She stood behind her sister without saying a word, offering support in the only way she could in such a volatile moment. Meanwhile, royal aides scrambled behind the scenes, desperate to contain the fallout. They had already failed to prevent the confrontation, but what mattered now was managing its aftermath. Reports suggest internal communication protocols were triggered, with urgent requests to limit leaks to the press. But whispers were already spreading. Staff who witnessed the exchange were shaken, and one senior aide admitted privately what had started as a denied entry at a security briefing had now escalated into a full-blown family rupture. Trust was crumbling, allegiances were being tested, and Beatrice, once a symbol of quiet royal grace, was now at the epicenter of a scandal no one saw coming. But even as emotions ran high, a deeper and more dangerous truth loomed beneath one that links to a secret surveillance operation hidden in plain sight. In the bowels of the royal estate, a top-tier security briefing was unfolding. One not just about threats from outside the palace, but from within. Prince Edward's exclusion of Beatrice's husband may not have been personal at all, but tactical. Because what was being discussed wasn't just security, it was infiltration. Sources close to palace intelligence confirm the briefing wasn't routine. This wasn't about crowd control at a public engagement or cyber threats to royal correspondence. It was about something far more chilling, an internal breach. Alarms had been quietly triggered in recent months after sensitive documents, intended only for the sovereign's eyes, were found circulating within international media circles. The documents weren't explosive on their own, but they pointed to something far more dangerous. Someone close, someone trusted, had access to what they shouldn't, and someone had talked. The palace was no longer just under observation, it was under suspicion. It didn't take long before MI5, already monitoring cyber leaks tied to major UK institutions, turned their gaze toward the crown. Prince Edward, who has long acted as a shadow liaison between royal tradition and national security, was briefed directly. Advisors urged discretion, immediate tightening of all informational access, and most critically, zero tolerance for unvetted individuals, regardless of their family connections. And it was during this sweep that a name appeared not flagged for criminal activity, but listed due to proximity. Beatrice's husband was identified as a social vector. The classification didn't allege guilt, it pointed to association. A chain of contacts, overseas business links, and one event invitation in particular raised questions. Questions the palace could no longer afford to ignore. Edward had a decision to make: wait and risk the integrity of the briefing, or act swiftly and risk igniting family tensions. He chose the latter. His move, now so publicly scrutinized, was in fact backed by some of the country's highest intelligence advisors. According to insiders, the information discussed in that room included confidential assessments of royal assets, vulnerabilities in estate security protocols, and the early stages of a counter-infiltration operation. This wasn't palace gossip. This was national stability. And Edward, the often overlooked son of the late Queen, stood at the center of it all, quietly shouldering a burden that came with zero room for compromise. But perhaps the most explosive detail remains buried behind closed lips. During that same briefing, a second name reportedly surfaced: Prince Andrew. While no official confirmation has been released, two independent sources with access to internal memos have stated that Andrew's past connections, once thought dormant, have become relevant again. His communications, his movements, his association with certain figures under investigation, none of it escaped scrutiny. Whether this was a renewal of old suspicions or the surfacing of new evidence remains unclear. But what is clear is this: the meeting was never intended to exclude out of malice. It was designed to protect. Still, optics matter. In locking one man out, Prince Edward unlocked a maelstrom of internal chaos. What began as a defensive operation became a trigger for emotional fallout across the royal branches. Allegiances began to shift, old wounds reopened, and the crown, already navigating turbulent waters, now faced an even darker reality. Threats were no longer knocking from the outside. They were slipping through the cracks within. As the shadow of secrecy thickened, the focus shifted from the decision itself to the consequences fracturing already fragile alliances within the family. The firm thrives on unity. But one private act of exclusion has become a royal earthquake. With Beatrice furious, Andrew incensed, and even Charles caught off guard, Prince Edward's firm stance has opened an emotional wound within the monarchy, and no one is sure how far it will spread. Prince Andrew, already a figure wrapped in controversy and sidelined from public royal duties, reportedly exploded when news of his son-in-law's exclusion reached him. Sources say he stormed through Windsor's halls, demanding explanations, furious that a member of his family had been humiliated in front of senior staff and advisors. To him, this wasn't just a personal insult, it was a power play, one that signaled his diminishing influence and the ascension of a new axis of authority. His call to King Charles was immediate and unusually direct. He questioned Edward's authority to act unilaterally and warned of irreparable consequences if the decision stood unchallenged. But Andrew wasn't the only one grappling with the fallout. Sophie Wessex, loyal wife to Edward, and often a quiet peacemaker in the family's darker moments, found herself trapped in a moral bind. She understood the stakes of the security concerns, yet she also felt the raw weight of what Beatrice was enduring. Reports suggest she reached out privately to Beatrice, attempting to calm the fire before it consumed more than just egos. But her efforts, though genuine, were swept away by a tidal wave of resentment that had been building beneath the surface for years. And now, it was all flooding out. Behind closed doors, Princess Anne, the monarchy's most seasoned soldier, allegedly cautioned Edward about the cost of such a move. She had seen what happens when the family turns on itself, how fractures become fault lines, and how silence turns into exile. Anne wasn't defending Beatrice's husband as much as she was defending the fragile cohesion the family needed to survive. She reminded Edward that even when security demanded action, diplomacy demanded tact. But Edward, firm in his convictions, believed this moment called for clarity, not compromise. The line had been drawn, and he wasn't about to step back. The magnitude of the crisis forced King Charles to intervene. An emergency council was quietly arranged, not as a formality, but out of necessity. Charles, who had already been walking a delicate tightrope between tradition and transformation, now faced a decision that would define his reign's tone. Publicly, he remained measured. Privately, insiders say he was shaken. He had underestimated how deep the tensions had become and how swiftly they could erupt. Worse, he now found himself in the middle of two competing visions of the monarchy's future: Edward's rigid protectionism and Andrew's desperate push for inclusion. And then there was William. Though he said nothing publicly, those closest to him noticed a subtle but powerful shift. He stood with Edward. His silence wasn't neutral, it was endorsement. To William, the time for soft diplomacy had passed. He had seen too many moments where unchecked access led to scandal, and he wasn't willing to repeat history. His quiet alignment with Edward didn't go unnoticed, and for Andrew, it felt like a betrayal too deep to forgive. But no reaction carried more weight than Camilla's. She said nothing. She did nothing. And yet, her silence was deafening. Insiders believe she is watching the storm unfold with practiced calculation, aware that her own rise was once mocked, then embraced, and now weaponized as a cautionary tale. Her lack of involvement isn't indifference, it's strategy. Because in a house where every whisper matters, silence can be the most powerful move of all. Yet, as royal dynamics shattered under pressure, one voice remained calm: Beatrice's husband. But his silence may have hidden a secret of his own. While the public sees a charming entrepreneur, security officials see patterns that don't sit right. The quiet scrutiny into Beatrice's husband began long before the security meeting, uncovering ties, trips, and contacts that have royal aides whispering. Was this man simply collateral in a political game, or was Edward trying to stop something darker from unfolding? The royal family is no stranger to scandal, but this time, it wasn't whispers in the tabloids that set alarm bells, ringing. It was data. A slow accumulation of intelligence reports, pulled together by silent observers in the background, began to form a troubling mosaic. Business dealings conducted abroad, seemingly innocuous at first, led to partnerships with entities flagged by UK intelligence services, a financial relationship in the Middle East, a consulting contract linked to a private group under quiet investigation, and a web of acquaintances that, on their own, were irrelevant. But together, they painted a portrait that security advisors could not ignore. Then came the communications. Not criminal, not overtly suspicious, but frequent enough, encrypted enough, and linked to enough red-flagged individuals to cause concern. One message in particular, intercepted and partially decoded, mentioned plans tied to Windsor, though no further context could be drawn. Still, to officials already on edge, it was enough to launch an internal assessment. That assessment began to track not just his dealings, but his growing visibility inside the palace. In recent months, Beatrice's husband had moved from the periphery to the centre. His name appeared on guest lists once reserved for senior royals. His access privileges expanded, slowly but unmistakably. He began asking questions about palace operations, about infrastructure, even about historic escape routes embedded in the architecture. It was chalked up to curiosity at first. But when he made an unusual request to tour specific palace quarters used for security briefings, ones not generally open to spouses, eyebrows rose. When he was politely denied, he reportedly asked again, this time more insistently. That moment, according to insiders, marked the first serious red flag. And then came the overseas meeting. Just weeks before the security briefing incident, Beatrice's husband reportedly flew to a quiet destination in Eastern Europe under the guise of a business retreat. What happened during that visit remains sealed within intelligence circles, but the timing alone raised questions. That trip coincided almost exactly with the release of sensitive royal-related financial documents that had been quietly leaked to international outlets. Coincidence? Perhaps. But to those tasked with defending the institution, it was enough to shift their posture from observation to containment. Behind the palace's serene facade, royal aides walked a tightrope. No one wanted to accuse without cause, but no one wanted to be the one who ignored the signs. There is a potential breach unconfirmed, unnamed, and yet undeniably present in every whispered conversation in the corridors of power. Prince Edward, burdened with responsibility and devoid of sentiment, acted not out of emotion, but from what he believed was necessity. He didn't wait for proof. He responded to risk, and in doing so, he may have prevented something that has yet to fully emerge. But even as questions piled up around Beatrice's husband, someone else made a move that shifted the entire narrative. Prince William. In a rare behind-the-scenes maneuver, Prince William reportedly met privately with Prince Edward, then emerged with a statement that left no doubt where his loyalties lie. But in choosing sides, William may have unwittingly deepened a growing rift that now threatens more than just family ties. The royal family has always lived by a rule of silence, never complain, never explain. But this time, the silence cracked. After days of growing speculation, subtle tension, and unanswered questions, Prince William broke ranks and stepped into the shadows of controversy. His words were brief, calculated, and yet devastatingly clear. Security must always come before ceremony. That one sentence, dropped like a dagger into the bloodstream of palace politics, sent every corner of the monarchy into a frenzied deciphering game. No names were mentioned, but the subtext was unmistakable. It was a direct challenge to Andrew's outrage, a quiet dismissal of Beatrice's fury, and above all, an endorsement of Prince Edward's controversial decision. The media latched on instantly. Headlines branded it a cold-blooded alignment, a royal son standing shoulder to shoulder with the monarchy's most rigid enforcer. Royal commentators suggested William's statement was less about policy and more about principle, that he was staking his claim not just in the matter at hand, but in the broader war shaping the future of the institution. The whispers grew louder. There were now two monarchies forming under the same roof. One rooted in tradition, rule, and scrutiny, the other still clinging to emotional connection and familial loyalty. And William had chosen his kingdom. Yet behind closed doors, the tension was far from resolved. Catherine, ever the quiet diplomat, reportedly reached out to Beatrice herself. It wasn't about defending William. It was a plea for perspective. In a conversation said to have lasted nearly an hour, Catherine is believed to have reminded Beatrice of what was at stake, not just for the individuals involved, but for the legacy of the crown itself. Her voice, calm but urgent, urged unity over resentment. But those closest to Beatrice said the wound was still too raw. A line had been crossed, and the message had been made clear. The inner circle had closed, and she was no longer within it. Sources also revealed that William had been receiving direct updates from intelligence agencies well before the public clash erupted. He knew what Edward knew, and perhaps more. The MI5 briefings reportedly included classified threats against the Crown's infrastructure, including a leaked reference to a senior royal being unknowingly compromised. Whether or not Beatrice's husband was named, the implications were serious enough for William to conclude that no amount of familial comfort could outweigh the risks at hand. Adding weight to William's decision were the murmurs from Queen Elizabeth's former aides. A small circle of her most trusted advisers privately shared that the late monarch had foreseen such a divide, one where bloodlines alone would no longer be enough to guarantee loyalty. She had warned that the crown would one day be forced to choose between kinship and caution. That day, it seems, had arrived. Now, behind the palace walls, a theory is gaining dangerous traction. The monarchy is splintering into two factions, those aligned with William, Edward, and Anne, guardians of legacy and silence. And those caught in the margins, Andrew, Beatrice, and those whose connections to the crown were once secure, but now seem to teeter on the edge. The illusion of unity has cracked, and the consequences are just beginning to emerge. But just as the dust seemed to settle, a new twist emerged from the shadows of the past, an overlooked letter with explosive implications. Locked away in Windsor's private vaults was a letter few had seen written by the late Queen herself. In it, she offered a chilling glimpse into her fears about the future of the monarchy and named individuals she believed would test its boundaries. What it revealed about Beatrice's marriage stunned even her most loyal supporters. The letter, sealed with the Queen's personal insignia and tucked inside a collection of final correspondences, was never meant to be public. It was penned during the last months of her reign, a time when her health was quietly declining, but her clarity remained razor-sharp. Those close to her say she became increasingly reflective in those final days, not just about her own legacy, but about the shape of the institution she had defended for over 70 years. She had seen empires crumble from within, not from enemies without. And so, in her own hand, she committed to paper a private warning not for the press, not for the public, but for the crown itself. The letter did not condemn. It cautioned. It spoke of the risks of opening the royal gates too wide, too quickly, of how the desire for modernity could become the very force that tears down centuries of structure. And then, in a tone colder than any public statement she ever made, the Queen mentioned a name, not in anger, in foresight. She referenced Beatrice's future husband, described him as well-positioned, charismatic, and ambitious, but warned that proximity does not equal allegiance. She noted the speed at which the relationship had evolved and advised those reading to exercise vigilance, for history has shown us that charm is not a substitute for character. The content of the letter was never supposed to resurface. But during a recent audit of archived materials, part of a sweeping effort by King Charles to consolidate and preserve the Queen's private documents, it was rediscovered. Quietly handed to senior advisors, then escalated to the King himself. Those present at the moment, Charles read it, say his demeanor changed instantly. It wasn't rage, it was a slow, dawning recognition. A puzzle piece falling into place. And suddenly, Edward's actions, once viewed as severe, took on an entirely different light. Charles reportedly said very little. He didn't order an investigation. He didn't summon Beatrice. But for those who've watched his leadership closely, his silence often signals something deeper than words. It was not indecision. It was burden. Because if the Queen's instincts had been right, if she had truly seen what others could not, then his next move would define how history remembered him not just as a monarch, but as a son. The resurfacing of this letter shifted the entire palace dynamic. It vindicated Edward's suspicion. It reframed William's alignment. And it placed Beatrice in a tragic, agonizing position caught between the man she loved and the institution that raised her. Those who once rallied behind her began to hesitate. The narrative was no longer about exclusion, it was about foresight. And the Queen's voice, long silent, had now returned with haunting authority. But the monarchy is no stranger to secrets. And as one warning came to light, another decision made in silence was about to change everything. Long before the briefing, Prince Edward made a vow behind closed doors to uphold a buried royal pact, one that places crown over kin, silence over scandal. That pact has now come into play, forcing Edward to act in a way few could stomach. But when the survival of the monarchy is at stake, the cost of betrayal is secondary to the preservation of power. It began years ago, far from the noise of press conferences and balcony appearances. In a room filled with the heavy air of tradition and duty, Queen Elizabeth summoned three of her most trusted confidants, Edward, Anne, and William. She knew the world was changing. The institution that had weathered war, abdication, and rebellion was now battling something more corrosive, the quiet erosion of trust from within. And so, she devised a plan not meant for the public, nor for the rest of the family. A pact forged in secrecy. A vow to act not as siblings or sons, but as sentinels of the crown's integrity. They would be the monarchy's last line of defense, a council of three, bound not by blood, but by absolute obligation. Edward took that oath seriously. He had always stood in the shadow of louder figures, but in silence, he became the gatekeeper. His role wasn't to shine, it was to shield. And when whispers of internal risk began to circle the palace, it wasn't hesitation that stirred within him, it was duty. The Queen had warned of emotional entanglements, of outsiders whose charm could cloud royal judgment. She had told them to expect the test to come not from enemies, but from loved ones. And now, that test had arrived. Beatrice's marriage had been quietly flagged years ago. Not in tabloids or gossip columns, but within the inner framework of royal intelligence briefings. There had been questions, subtle ones about affiliations, investments, and motivations. At the time, Charles had chosen not to act. He believed in reconciliation, in offering space for the next generation to define its path. But Edward had never forgotten the Queen's words. And so, when the moment arrived when that security meeting was called, he knew it was not spontaneous. It was a culmination, a final checkpoint, and he followed through. The decision to block Beatrice's husband was not an impulsive reaction. It was the fulfillment of a premeditated plan, one born from the Queen's dying wish that the monarchy be protected from within, no matter the cost. Edward knew it would fracture trust. He knew it would devastate Beatrice. But the pact demanded allegiance to the crown first. Everything else, family, comfort, sentiment, came second. He wasn't acting as an uncle. He was acting as a guardian of a crumbling fortress, trying to seal a breach before it became a collapse. Anne stood by him quietly. William, though more visible, mirrored his resolve. The three, bound by that oath, understood the consequences. And still, they moved forward. Because power, in its purest form, is not about influence, it is about sacrifice. And Edward, in that moment, sacrificed his relationship with his niece to fulfill a promise that predated her crisis. Beatrice's pain was real, her outrage justified, but to Edward, the cost of doing nothing was too great. Charles, when confronted with the resurfaced warnings and the pressure mounting around him, didn't stop Edward. He allowed the decision to stand. Perhaps in that moment, he too realized that the Queen's vision, once dismissed as caution, had now become prophecy. The Council of Three had acted, and the monarchy, though rattled, remained intact. And now, with lines drawn, loyalties tested, and secrets exposed, the future of Beatrice's role and her marriage stands on the edge of a royal blade. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.